I want to welcome everyone to this PowerPoint. This PowerPoint is on the 20s. It's the first part. It's about buying and consuming more of everything. The 20s was about prosperity. You heard the phrase, I'm sure, the roaring 20s, the jazz age. This is the age when Americans developed many of the habits they have today. Their fascination, for instance, with mass-produced goods, with technology, technological wonders, with buying things, and the importance of things to show status, for instance, to show that you're a part of a group or not a part of a group for that matter. In any case, things come into their own, partly because of mass production and mass consumption. Those two things are called Fordism. All right. So buying and consuming more of everything. I want to ask you, what is your image of the 20s? What do you think of instantly? And that, of course, might change depending on when you were born. But in my day, the 20s were known for flappers, for women, for instance, who had bobbed hair and who smoked cigarettes, who frequented jazz clubs and mingled with people, unchaperoned. For all of these reasons, flappers were considered to be abandoned women, which is rather funny today, but being an abandoned woman wasn't silly then, of course. And that time, people were rebelling really against the Victorian customs, a Victorian morality code. So the 20s were many different things. What we want to do is we want to complicate the picture you have of the 20s with this presentation. It starts, of course, with post-war prosperity. And in this image, you see many of the items that were for sale and that were being mass-produced in America at this time. These were all sort of new, cutting-edge technological wonders. You have, for instance, this oven in the center here. You have a percolator. You have an electric andiron or iron. This was different from the old type, which you would have to put on, let's say, a radiator or on a heater or on the stove in order to warm it up. And there are many other things here. This kind of looks like a mailbox. I don't know if that's a wonder, but it was being mass-produced and probably at prices that were unheard of at the time, extremely cheap. All right. The 20s were therefore a very prosperous time for many, not for all, but for many, and more people than perhaps at any other time in American history. By 1922, the second industrial revolution, remember, was underway, and that revolution was powered by electricity. And the war was very much a trigger, an accelerator of these technological changes. It stimulated development and investment in new technology. And this created a boom between 1923 and 1929. You should know that the 20s are really dated from those dates, 23 to 29. As you probably know, after the war ended in 1918 for the United States, there was a rocky period of about 5 years before America transitioned from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. In any case, it did by 1923. Electricity became widespread and industrial production more efficient, and there were mass-produced consumer goods like the kind on the left in that picture. These became available now at affordable prices, and that's important because, of course, these items existed before, in many cases 30, 40 years before, but the price was far too steep for the average American to afford. So consumption grew, and so the title of this presentation. And remember, when you couple mass production with mass consumption, what you have is what economists call Fordism. And of course, it's named after Henry Ford, because in many ways, he pioneered the moving assembly line, he pioneered mass production, he pioneered the production of goods that were finally affordable to the average American. Many of the most notable inventions facilitated communication, and the most important of those was radio. On radio, you could also, of course, hear about what the new gizmos were. Advertising was taken to a new level, sort of a high art, if that's possible. And of course, film also contributed to what your book calls the homogenization of ideas. Now, that's a mouthful, but homogenize means that sort of local products began to disappear as these mass-produced products began to flood the market. And so more and more people were smoking the same cigarettes, and wearing the same type of clothes. They were driving the same kind of car. That's what's meant by homogenization. Prosperity was built upon a cycle, and that cycle is well illustrated here. It starts with mass-produced goods at the very top. You used to have machines and factories pouring out these standardized goods. What's keeping the workers there and what's keeping the factories running 24 hours a day is that, for the most part, workers are getting higher wages. And this, of course, is not only good for workers, and it reduces turnaround, the loss of workers, but it also allows them to buy the products that they're making. And so standardized mass-produced goods, machines and factories running 24 hours, higher wages, all means that more and more consumer goods are hitting the market. More and more people can afford them. So the cycle created the business boom. Standardized mass production led to more efficient machines, and this in turn led to the booming production and rising wages. These in turn led to increased demand for consumer goods. People had cash in their pockets. More what's called discretionary income was available. So all of this fueled corporate profits, and corporations really made out well in the 20s. More standardized mass-produced goods. They were not works of art, obviously. They seem a little cheap and gaudy today, but nevertheless, they were marvels, really, for the people for whom such things never existed or were never within their reach. Even something as simple as a steel mashed potato masher. That was remarkable. And of course, everybody had to have one. And it quite a signal to others that you had achieved middle-class status. Let's look at different facets of the economy quickly. One was industry. Industry in the period from 1922 to 1928, so about 6 years, industrial production shot up at an amazing rate, 70%. Many people thought, because of those numbers, the numbers I'm about to present to you, that America had conquered poverty, the first society to do so. Of course, these people were wrong, but it tells you the optimism of the age that such a prediction could be made. Gross national product, in other words, the total value of the goods produced by the nation, went up 40%. Per capita, per head income, per American income went up 30%. That's a key figure because, again, it's that number that allowed Americans to participate in this consumption, this record consumption. Output per factory man per hour. This is another important aspect of industry. It's not simply that the factories were being run full out, that they were applying scientific management to them, but that the efficiency of each worker had increased up to 75%. And finally, corporate profits. Of course, they went through the roof, 62%. Electric power powered almost everything in the 20s. Coal was still being used, obviously, and still was an important resource, especially in the countryside. But in the cities, electricity took off. The percentage increase in the 30-year period, 1899 to 1929, 331%. Industries powered by electricity grew by 50%. Those factories that were now using electricity for power, that were now being run out straight 24 hours, 7 days a week. Well, maybe not 7, 6 days a week. They had, of course, have to have a labor force, and worker incomes went up as well. Not as much as corporate profits. And that's still true today. But nevertheless, it was not negligible. They went up 11%. Real earnings, in other words, after you deduct taxes and other expenses, these went up 22% for employed wage earners. The average work week went down. So people were working fewer hours. They were making more money on average. And that combination is almost unbeatable. What made it all possible? Well, there were a lot of things that made it all possible. One of the things was scientific management. In other words, look at the workplace and try to devise strategies by which you can make each worker's movements more efficient. There's less wasted action. There's less wasted material. In every way, what were called scientific managers, or Taylorites, as they were called after Frederick Taylor, again, attempted to make the workplace a more efficient place. Industries began to employ automated machinery for the first time, and scientific management was all the rage. if you were to go to a business school at this time, this is what you would be taught, the principles of scientific management. One of those was to reorganize work so that there would be more spare time for the worker and more disposable income. And as we saw, that indeed happened. It also led to a decline, though, in the importance of skill in favor of discipline and subordination. In other words, the factories had moving assembly lines now to produce the mass-produced goods, but the jobs that the people on the line, as it was called, did tended to be very simplified. They didn't require a lot of brain power, let's put it that way. They were repetitive jobs, jobs in which you would attach a bolt here, you would maybe turn a knob there, and then it would be sent down to the next station on the assembly line. Their next group of workers would do, again, fairly simple acts. By keeping the work simple in this way, of course, anybody could do it, and therefore you could always find work. You also didn't have to employ skilled labor, and that meant you could keep your labor expenses down. Businesses financed industrial research for the first time and time studies on a grand scale. What is a time study? It's basically where experts would go into the workplace with cameras and clipboards, and they would set up their cameras and record the actions that the worker underwent in order to carry out their work. And then they would study those images and suggest ways in which the worker and the workplace could be organized in such a way that those actions could be simplified, could be sped up, or could be made more safe, all in the name of efficiency. The man who was behind scientific management was Frederick W. Taylor. And in his book, The Principles of Scientific Management, which, by the way, was a bestseller, he applied what he calls scientific management for the first time, also known as Taylorism. And the man who embraced all of these things and went further with them than anyone else was Henry Ford. Ford, of course, is going to introduce the first really affordable mass-produced car, the Model T. He's going to introduce the moving assembly line. That's going to be applied in a lot of other areas for the making of appliances and also for the making of homes. Believe it or not, homes could be made on this assembly line model. Ford also created his own, in a sense, nation, community, whatever you want to call it. It was called Fordlandia. Ford was unhappy with American industrialization because he felt that people were too much stuck in their old ways of doing business. He wanted to control every aspect of the production of his cars. And so he needed rubber, he needed glass, he needed oil, and he sort of speculated in all of those industries. He went to Brazil and he founded what was called Fordlandia in order to produce rubber for his cars, the tires, and other parts of the car. He thought if he could be a producer of those things, he could reduce the price and make the Model T even more affordable for the average American. Well, Fordlandia was an amazing failure, and it's easy to laugh at it now, of course, and to sort of make fun of Ford and his idealism. But it was a bold venture. It really was. The rubber plants failed. They died in the fields. He had a hard time keeping workers in the factory, and the workers rebelled. They refused to become sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who saved their money, even though they were being paid well. It was a fiasco. And you can still find, though, evidence of Fordlandia in Brazil. And the rainforest makes a rather interesting sight, but you can find it there. And there are any number of good books on this. So scientific management and the reorganization of work. One of the things that Ford pioneered was paying the workers very, very well while reducing their workday. Now, it might seem odd after I tell you that, to say also that he had a hard time keeping workers in the factory. And that tells you some of the problems that he faced. He tried to coax them in with a $5 a day wage, which was unheard of at that time. It was amazingly high. And so at first, many people flooded into Ford plants. The problem is that, as I said, the work was repetitive, it was mind-numbing, and people were hard to keep on the line. Many of them bolted. He tried to sort of incentivize the job a bit more by offering a profit-sharing plan, and that's what this graphic shows you. He invited the employees to have a share in the profits, hoping, of course, that they would become more invested in their work and in the company itself. It seemed a bright idea, and of course, profit sharing is used today, but there are certain problems with it. It's not the best solution to every industry. In any case, it didn't keep enough people in the factories, and so Ford was always trying to keep them there, finding new gimmicks and tricks to do so. Um, he was dead set against labor unions, and you may know this already, that Ford detested unions. He felt that they were anti-corporate corporation, they were anti-American, and he fought them tooth and nail. Some of the bloodiest battles in labor history are going to be fought at his plants, in his factories. General Motors was the chief rival of Ford, and for a long time, Ford pretty much controlled and had a dominant share in car production. But by 1927, something sort of remarkable happened. It's remarkable because you saw General Motors eclipse Ford with cars like the one shown here, the Cadillac LaSalle. But you also had sort of real competition finally against Ford and sort of the cars that he was making. General Motors tended to aim for sort of a higher demographic, people who had a bit more cash in their pocket. Ford, in order to compete with General Motors, put out that very snazzy number that you see on the right, the Model A. And so the rivalry went on. Car production. Automobiles were one of the key industries in the prosperity of the 1920s. And again, it involves many other industries, of course, glass, steel, oil, rubber. These industries were brought along as the car prospered, and as more and more people bought them, these industries also prospered. And all of the attendant businesses that were required to service the car, gas stations had to be devised, believe it or not. Roads, better roads, had to be made. And so road technology made a huge advance in this time. All right. So GM tapped into the emerging consumer psychology. It knew that people wanted something more than simply a black, sturdy car, the Model T. And so they began to produce very stylistic cars. They updated their models yearly. And they created need, in a sense. They marketed need. They manufactured need. And they marketed them very aggressively. And this ties in another industry, of course, and that is advertising, public relations. In order to help people who wanted to buy cars, the installment plan was devised. Consumer credit grew by leaps and bounds. Finally, in 1927, Ford Motor Company, in the face of these sort of innovations, took a cue from GM, General Motors' success, and introduced their model, the Model A, and more or less advertised constantly on the radio, in newspapers, magazines. The automobile, therefore, and the American culture of the automobile were born. In this ad, for instance, you see a young man delivering a newspaper to a woman at a picket fence, and at the curb is this shiny, sleek machine. This was the iPhone of the 1920s. The explosive growth of the automobile industry revolutionized American life, much like the railroad had in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And as we said with the railroad, as the railroad goes, so goes America. In many ways, as the automobile industry went, so went America. Henry Ford's innovations were countless, and I've listed some of them for you. His production technique was the most important, the moving assembly line. But he also, of course, made a product that Americans could afford. That's what mass production allows you to do. It gives you economies of scale, as the economists will say, which more or less says that if you are producing a good at a vast scale, huge units or a great number of units, that means you can get special deals from your suppliers of raw materials. He used that strategy very effectively, so that by the end of the decade, there were enough cars on the road for every one of 5 people to own one. That's 20% of Americans who could drive at that time. By 1929, it was 1 out of 2 American families owned a car. Owning two was fabulous wealth, or it indicated fabulous wealth. Notice here, this is called a runabout, this car in the image, and notice the price, $265. That was very low. No one really could rival Ford in his prices until the mid 1920s at least. So related industries sprang up, as I said, service facilities, filling stations, motels. Eventually, in a few more years, McDonald's is going to be born right here in San Bernardino, California, and the rest is history. I encourage you, I invite you to carry out this experiment when you go home today and you're driving down, I don't know, Pico, Santa Monica. Simply look around and count all of the businesses you see that in one way or another are related with cars, whether they sell tires, whether they sell gas, whether it's a smog inspection station, you name it, just count them. And you'll see that the car still very much has an important place in our economy. So the 20s were a period of consumption and consumer goods. In this image, I'm showing you perhaps one of the most important, other than the car here, one of the most important inventions of the time, the radio. Radio took off. It was entertainment, but it was also a means, of course, of advertising these things, the cars, but many other things. Listerine, for instance, medications, lotions, almost anything could be sold on the radio, and was. It was a consumer habit also in that people consumed not simply bought these things, but they consumed cultural products. In this case, this image of the Los Angeles Theater. Movies, of course, were the main form of entertainment in the 1920s, and about 90 million people a week. Imagine that, 90 million people a week went to the movies. And when they went, of course, the owners of the movie theaters wanted to give them not simply entertainment, but they wanted to make them feel as if they had been transported to another time, sort of a Versailles, a palace of gilt and gold. And you see that in this image here, the chandeliers, for instance. You see it in the moldings. You see it in the artwork. So it was an amazing place. To go to a movie was an experience. It got you out of your humdrum life. It offered you entertainment. It exercised your creativity. It's hard really to underestimate the power that movies had at this time. So advertising was extremely important. And when we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the principles of advertising were and what some of the most important products were in the jazz age.